Good afternoon, everyone. I think we should get started. Vitor has a flight to take by the end of this session, so this is the last session of the day on macroeconomic effects of fiscal policy and uncertainty. Again, we're going to have only two papers, 30 minutes for presentation, 15 minutes, so a longer time to discuss. We're first going to have Miguel Bandeira presenting his paper. The title just changed, Expansionary Austerity. Miguel Bandeira is a professor from INSPER, and Vitor, we borrowed him from the previous session. Is going to discuss. So, Miguel, please, the floor is yours. Let's get started. You have 30 minutes.
Okay. So thank you to the organizing committee to putting our paper into the program. Thank you, Angelo, for moderating. I'm going to be talking about expansionary austerity, which is joint work with my colleagues, Marco Bonomo, Marcos Mendes, and a familiar face to many of you, Carlos, who is at Capitalo and PUC. Just two disclaimers before we start. So the paper went through a major overhaul in the last 3 to 4 months, so we changed the title, and only slides are available, but the draft should be available in our web pages soon. Related to that, I need to apologize our discussant, Vitor, who got the updated version only a week ago. I'm sorry about that. So let me start with the observation that the fiscal landscape is changing across the globe, okay? In the last 2 decades, we witnessed 2 major crises with monetary policy constrained at the zero lower bound, and that led to record peacetime primary deficits and increases in debt levels. Now, this situation and this new scenario is not transitory, with many institutions forecasting increases in debt levels over the next decades. This raises concerns, and IMF, OECD already raised those concerns about debt sustainability and the long-term fiscal balance across the world. This new scenario opens a whole set of new interesting questions. And one of those questions, which is the question that we want to address in this paper, is what are the implications of a scenario with fiscal concerns for fiscal policy itself, for the effectiveness of fiscal policy? And in particular, what are the effects of fiscal policy in a context marked by concerns about debt sustainability? Now, if we were to try to learn from an empirical perspective, looking at advanced economies wouldn't work because this is a new scenario for them. But perhaps your first reaction is, let's look at emerging markets, because in emerging markets, this scenario might be aggravating, but is not new. In emerging markets, debt concerns are long-standing. The long history of fiscal responsibility, in some cases sovereign default, and perhaps the proof of what I'm saying is that emerging markets just face higher sovereign risk premium. Great, so that offers us the scenario, but clean identification of fiscal policy effects in emerging markets is challenging. Why? Because the state of the art in the literature explores, typically as sources of exogenous variations, long time series that span periods of wars, and then explore periods of military conflict as a source of exogenous variations. Now, in emerging markets, we don't have either long time series or wars, right? So we're going to argue that we're going to study the Brazilian case, and we think the Brazilian case is a good context or a good laboratory to address this question. Why? Because, no surprise here, Brazil is an emerging economy with a long history of fiscal problems and debt, in an economy where debt sustainability concerns are at the forefront of the public debate. So that gives us the context marked with fiscal concerns. Now, what sets Brazil apart from, not just from other emerging markets, but pretty much from any other any other economy in the world, which is in Brazil, we observe fiscal expectations at daily frequency. That's thanks to this institution, and in particular to the focus server, the central bank market expectation system. So we're going to leverage that to pursue high-frequency identification, which I'll argue that has several advantages of fiscal policy effects using Brazil as our laboratory. What are we going to do? So we're going to construct a new high-frequency measure of fiscal shocks. That high-frequency measure, I'm going to enter details in a second, but it involves the changes in primary surplus expectations around fiscal events. The expectations will come from the focus survey, and the fiscal events we had a lot of work in getting those. We're going to identify those using a large language model, an LLM, and we'll train it to read over 25,000 news headlines from Bloomberg. Now, once we have expectations and the events, we compute the changes in expectations in narrow windows around the events. That's our measure of fiscal shocks. And then we estimate dynamic causal effects using local projections. What do we find? We find that fiscal austerity is expansionary. And in particular, a shock that increases realized primary surplus after 1 year in percent of GDP by 36 basis points lead to GDP increases of 0.5% and a price level fall of 0.3%. And what's the mechanism? The mechanism that we'll argue, and I'll show several bits of evidence, of empirical evidence to support our chain of reasoning, is that in a context marked by fiscal concerns, fiscal austerity lowers the perception of fiscal risk and the overall uncertainty in the economy. And we just seem to have found a case where that effect dominates the traditional Keynesian effect of fiscal policy. In particular, what we find that markets react positively to austerity. So in response to that shock, there's a fall in CDS, exchange rate appreciation, and a boom in the stock market. There's an increase in household and firms' confidence. Private credit conditions improve with an increase in credit volume and fall in credit spreads. Credit consumption and investment increase. There's a stronger labor market with falling unemployment and increase in real wages. And the price level falls because there's two counteracting effects here. One, the expansion in activity, which will lead it to increase, but then there's the exchange rate appreciation that comes with the positive market reaction. We attribute the fall in the price level to the dominating effect of the exchange rate. Okay? I'll skip the literature in the interest of time. Let me go straight to our measure of fiscal shocks. As anticipated, we're going to use changes in 1 year primary surplus expectations around fiscal events. Why is this nice? So the first thing is that we look at changes in expectations. And there's a big debate in the literature, in the fiscal literature, that some identification schemes they do not account for the anticipated nature of fiscal changes. So the whole debate of separating, is this a news shock, is this a current shock? Our goal here is not separate, but our measure of the shock, because it's based on forward-looking expectations, will capture both current and news. Okay, that's one thing. And the second part of why this is nice is the usual high frequency argument for exogenized. So we look at those changes around those fiscal events. So the argument is that around fiscal events, and I'm going to be more precise what I mean by around in one slide, but the argument is that in a narrow window, in a sufficiently narrow window around major fiscal events, those changes should be only reflecting the fiscal shocks. On paper, really nice, but building this shock series requires us two ingredients that are not easy to obtain. The first one is we rely on the central bank, but the peculiarity of Brazil is we would need to observe fiscal expectations at a high frequency. The second one, we will do the work. Half of the work the central bank does for us, the other half we do it. I think it's a fair split, which is to find a set of days that are marked by fiscal events. So going to the first of this ingredient, to the primary surplus expectations, most of you in this audience would know this, so I won't spend too much time. But the market expectation system from the central bank is available since 1999. It's basically a survey of professional forecasters that include several macro variables. And the twist is that participants can update their forecast at any given day. Out of this survey that contains many variables, our focus is on forecasts of primary surplus in % of GDP. We construct, these are fixed horizons in the surplus, so the agents forecast what's going to be the primary surplus for a given calendar year. We want to have a metric that is a constant 1 year ahead, so we construct 1 year ahead forecasts using linear interpolation, but when taking the changes of it, because of the linear interpolation, there's a mechanical effect of the passage of time, we do take care of that. We compute what we call fixed weight changes. We use the change in the median of forecasts. That's as a baseline. We also use average, and the results survive. So the bottom line is that agents can update their forecasts at any given day, but most agents won't update their forecasts every single day. So one way of getting variation around the events is to focus on a moment on that distribution and not look at the overall changes. And then the other way we deal with the lack of updates is that we take a fiscal event and we use a window that starts on the day of the event and goes all the way to the last working day, or if it occurs at a Friday or at a weekend, it goes the window until Monday. That's, again, to allow for some variation, to allow for people to update. Why the first and last working day? Because there's evidence, anecdotal and also from other papers, we also computed in the data, I don't have it here in the slides, that the frequency of updates, it's bigger in the first or the last working days of the week. That's it for the first ingredient. The second ingredient is more complicated, slightly more intricate, which is how do we identify days marked by fiscal event, or what we call fiscal event days? So that begs the question of what is a fiscal event? No? In principle, that's any event stemming from kind of fiscal sources that changes either current or expected fiscal policy. For fiscal policy, this is tricky. Even though we like high-frequency identification because of the argument of exogeneity in a narrow window, we do it a lot. It appeared, now it has become the standard in the monetary literature. There's Diego Kanzig doing that for oil shocks around OPEC announcements and so on and so forth. But these events, when it comes to fiscal policy, they are inherently unstructured, no? Monetary policy, there's the Copom meeting, and then you know that is the fiscal event. For OPEC, there's the meeting of the OPEC, the press conferences, that's the event, that's when the shock occurs. With fiscal events, it's not that clear, and they tend to be inherently unstructured, and that's why it challenges, and there are much fewer papers, there's only 2 for the US that try to use high-frequency strategies for fiscal policy. How do we deal with that? We train a large language model to identify fiscal events from news headlines. So what we use, being more precise here, we use the daily top 3 from a tag or Bloomberg, that's the Brazilian economy news, from the 1st of January 2000 until the last day of 2023. So that's about a little bit more than 25,000 headlines. Just the size of the task shows us that it would be impossible to do this fully narrative, reading through them and then justifying every single choice. So we consider, and here there's a lot of work and a lot of brainstorming among the co-authors on precisely the first question, what is a fiscal event? And we consider news, or we train it to identify fiscal events if it's an event that has a direct effect on public finances, statements about by government officials about fiscal policy, and the monitoring of public accounts, releases by the Treasury, and so on. So, and then we have, for each day, we classify each of those 25,000 headlines as fiscal or not, and we'll consider a fiscal event day any day where the majority of the top 3 news of Bloomberg, meaning 2 or 3 news, are fiscal. So we find over from 2000 to 2023, that gives us 353 days. I'll have it in the next slide. There's lots of details here. Actually, this set of bullet points, these 5 bullet points that you see at the bottom, that's about 1 year of work on those bullet points, but there's a lot of work on how do we train an LLM, and we've learned a great deal, and we're going to make a very detailed appendix, hopefully making this a methodological contribution and a proof of concept that LLMs can be used to identify unstructured events from news headlines more generally. Right? Here's the series of the shocks that we're going to be using. So as we see, and perhaps as expected, there's more, or for those that know the Brazilian context, there's more negative shocks than positive ones. Negative shocks tend to be bigger, but there are positive shocks too. So for instance here, this was in 2003, the first one there. That's the headline behind that event is that Lula may cut spending by 7.5% to trim deficit, and that was against his own party. Then there was this one around there, 2008. I don't remember the year exactly, but that's Brazil to increase the surplus target for wealth fund. Then there's this. This was more recent on Guedes reinforces the push to keep the spending cap. On the negative side, we had, for instance, Brazilian government to cut 2010 primary surplus target by 3.3%. There's one in 2015, which is, the headline is Joaquim Levy is fed up and markets are nervous. Then there's one at the height of the pandemic, Brazil Economy Ministry sees 2020 fiscal deficit in 601 billion reais. I won't open more events in the interest of time, but in that button there's the top 12 of those events and what is behind. It's just to say, you know, to a point by Tiago Zilberman earlier, we're talking about it. It's just to say, when you think about Brazil, we tend to think about bad things. No, there's very few austerity. What we say is that there was some austerity, there's more increases in spending, but there is some austerity, and there are some concrete events behind that austerity. Now, given the shock measure, there's nothing fancy about the econometric approach, as simple as it gets. Plain local projections, regressing outcomes on the shock. Control variables include 3 months of lagged values of the dependent variable of the shock, and we saturate the local projections with a set of dummies to account for the great financial crisis, the trucker strike, and the pandemic. Use heteroscedasticity robust standard errors because we control for lags of the dependent variable. Our baseline sample is from 2004 to 2023, but the results are robust to using longest possible samples. So effects on fiscal variables and the macroeconomy we have there. So it's the responses to a 1 standard deviation fiscal shock on fiscal variables. This also helps me to translate 1 standard deviation, which is 6.4 basis points of the shock, translate that into magnitudes and not shock units, let's put it that way. So after an austerity shock, this is not just news. So the realized primary surplus, the graph on the left, increases and plateaus there after 2 years at the level of around 40 basis points. After 1 year, that effect is 36 basis points. And on the right panel, you see a decomposition of revenue and spending. And here, this is a result. We cannot look, we get a shock and we cannot choose what it does, doing a shock only on one side or on the other. That's a result. But we see that the increase in primary surplus is about equally divided between an increase in net revenue and a fall in total spending. Now, this is what the shock does to fiscal variables. Still here, nothing too surprising. Perhaps the surprise comes here. This is looking at GDP and CPI. So what we see is an increase in GDP and a fall in the CPI. So you're saying, standard textbook economics would say, an increase in government spending. No, that should be a positive aggregate demand shock. And what we find here is that in a setting marked by fiscal concerns, that same shock behaves as a positive supply shock. They might wonder, well, is there something wrong? Well, I try to convince you that our identification is particularly clean. We use high frequency around fiscal events. Also, what would need to violate that, maybe you're capturing some general form of optimism and you're capturing some other, in a systematic way, other positive aggregate demand shocks, and you're mixing up and you're calling that government spending shock. Well, for that to be, you'd need those supply shocks to occur in a systematic way in those 2 or 3 days that goes from the fiscal event to the last working day of the week. That's the beauty of the high frequency. If you're not convinced, then also if you're picking up a systematic aggregate supply shock instead of a real fiscal shock, you would expect, or an optimism shock, you would expect to see only an increase in net revenue and not a fall in government spending. If it's just optimism or a positive supply shock, it increases activity, it increases revenue, but it wouldn't affect government spending. So that's my pitch to try to convince you that identification is clean. You go, Ivan.
Yeah, do you have the result for positive spending shock?
I'll get to there at the end. It's in the the main result is maintained. The sign of it is maintained. But I'll have a word.
So you have a negative multiplier.
We have a negative multiplier. That's it. Yeah. So then, if identification is clean, then we need some kind of history, right? We need to understand what's the mechanism, what operates in economies marked by fiscal concerns. What is different? What is different than the standard textbook economics will tell you? Our story here is that fiscal austerity lowers the perception of fiscal risk and overall uncertainty in the economy, and in a context marked by fiscal concerns, that effect dominates the usual traditional Keynesian effect. So to support that claim, let me show you results on a broader set of variables. First thing, you could think, well, agents are tricked. They think there's going to be expansion, but then the austerity, but then the austerity doesn't happen. You trick them by some kind of tricking their expectations. No, that's not the case. On the left, you observe on the weekly frequency, we run this. So immediately in the week of the shock, there's an increase in fiscal expectations. That continues, and then on the right, you have the results at the monthly frequency with a continuum increase of those expectations consistent with the effect that you observe on realized variables. So that's the first piece of evidence. The second one is that financial markets react positively. There's falls in CDS, exchange rate appreciation, and stocks. And I'll divide this through the very short run and the sort of more medium run, because in the very short run, nothing else moved, right? You could think, well, if there's a positive supply shock, then GDP increases and then endogenous asset prices improve. But here, GDP barely moved. This is within the first month, so I'm doing it at the weekly frequency. And we see that immediately there's a fall in CDS, an appreciation of the exchange rate, and a boom in the stock market. That's in the very short run, the first 5 weeks after the shock. And those effects persist over the more medium run and up to 2 years. So credit default swaps fall there up until 20 basis points at 18 months, exchange rate appreciates, then go back, and then appreciates up to 2 something percent, and the boom of the stock market lasts about 6 months, and then it remains non-significant. Then, followed by the positive reaction by the market, there's a positive reaction in households and firms, right? This is the response to firms' confidence, consumer, and industry indices, and we see that for consumers and firms, things increase already on impact. Then credit conditions improve, private credit conditions. You could think as this as an improvement, the fall in CDS as an improvement in kind of sovereign credit conditions. This trickled down to an improvement in private credit conditions. On the left, you have an increase in private credit volume to firms, and which increases after 2 years by about 2.5%. And on the right, you have a sharp fall, about 150 basis points after 2 years, of the credit spread, the private credit spreads on the credit to firms. After that, and consistent with that, what we see is that the 2 biggest components of GDP increase, consumption goes up, investment goes up, and then followed by that, we have improvement in the labor market, with a fall of unemployment by around 40 basis points, an increase a little bit less than 1% in real wages, which then support the continuous more elevated level of consumption. That's it for activity. Prices fall due to an exchange rate appreciation. So that's the exchange rate, the same that I showed already on the left. And here, just to support this claim, what we have is the baseline, the full CPI, and we plot it again, components that are more and less sensitive to the exchange rate. So for instance, services falls slightly less, but the component that is more affected by the exchange rate, industrials, that falls more, okay? And this is our story. That's the story of the paper. In terms of sensitivity, we did a bunch of things. So I don't have all the graphs in here, but the results survive, say, using average expectations, using some measure orthogonalized by past releases, defining a fiscal day as, instead of the majority in top 3, as a day that only has a top 1 headline, using different ways of aggregating daily surprises into months, split rules, windows that are bigger, smaller. On the local projections, we tried different lags. We tried to control for lags of the macro factors, of 3 macro factors. You could use autocorrelation robust standard errors. It doesn't change inference. You could use the longest possible sample for each variable. You could drop all the way from just before the pandemic, and results survive. Now, to answer your question, Ivan, work in progress here. We're still working on some of these things, which is natural questions that arise. Sign and state-dependent effects. We're doing a baseline specification that doesn't discriminate neither on time periods nor on positive and negative shocks. So we extend the baseline specification to allow for sign-dependent effects. So is this really a story of expansionary austerity, or more of a story of a contractionary expansion? And we did that, some preliminaries to support both results. So if you do positive and negatives, magnitudes, we still are thinking about how to scale, but magnitudes, sign-wise, things behave like a mirror. Then another question is, well, you would expect, from my own argument, I argue that Brazil has fiscal concerns in the whole sample, but we know that those fiscal concerns have been perhaps even stronger in the last 10, 12 years. So you would expect that in the second part of the sample, with increased fiscal concerns, the results are even stronger. And we are running those results using, as a state variable, a dummy for the post-2014 period. Why post-2014? Along with Marcos, we have narrative arguments to detect that turning point on the fiscal concerns, just to see if this is validated. We are still working on this, okay? Let me just quickly wrap up. So I told you that the fiscal landscape is changing across the world, and in this new scenario, one of the important questions that arises is, what are the effects of fiscal policy in this new setting marked by concerns about fiscal sustainability or debt sustainability? To address this question, we explore the Brazilian context That's a great laboratory because of high-frequency daily expectations, which allows us to do high-frequency identification of fiscal policy shocks. What we find that fiscal austerity is expansionary, and the mechanism is that fiscal austerity lowers the perception of fiscal risk, and again, in a context marked by fiscal concerns, that, and we just found a case, that might dominate the traditional Keynesian effect of fiscal policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel, for your presentation. Now, Vitor Costa will present his comments.
So good afternoon again. Just two small disclaimers here. So as Miguel said, I was not given a full draft of this last version, so my comments will be a little bit thin, I guess, in what I may contribute. But I will read the paper as soon as there's a version available and provide longer comments when I can. And also I come from a more theoretical background, so I'll make more general comments about the paper proposed mechanism and some worries about the whole story, but I think that it's a very empirical paper, and there are a lot of people that can contribute on that. So I'll just start by briefly saying what the paper is about. So the paper is well motivated, I think. There's a growing concern with debt and deficits. Now, we were talking about this in previous session and now. So this is a very important topic to be addressed. And there is this key question, right? Can austerity be expansionary? And a lot of advocates for this argument, because it means a lot, right? We can then reduce debt and grow at the same time, and just the best of all worlds, right? So if it's true, it's very important. So in order to answer this question, the paper tries to measure these fiscal shocks using essentially primary surplus expectations, which here in Brazil we have is available in high frequency, and then a large language model to detect fiscal events, so that we can properly identify what of those changing expectations mean, when those changing expectations mean that it is a fiscal event, right? And then estimate the effects using local projections. So what I feel that the paper contributes is identify fiscal policy in Brazil and in an emerging economy. This is hard. We saw this being done for advanced economies using natural experiments, but it's a lot harder than identifying monetary shocks, and identifying more monetary shocks is already a difficult challenge. And it also contributes by using high-frequency identification, which means that we are using a lot more of the available information that we have. So one of my questions over the high frequency would be that, yes, we should use the data that is available, but my general intuition is that fiscal policy is something that is slow moving, right? It's something of a low frequency. We do not see daily budget changes. We do not see daily changes in tax policy. We actually have maybe a couple of changes in tax policy in one decade. So what are we actually capturing when we are integrating high frequency data? Is it possible that some of this is just other perceptions about the economy that we are confusing with fiscal events? So how can we be sure that we are actually measuring fiscal events? And the paper actually contributes with bringing large language models into identifying fiscal shocks, and then just I think not a question but a sort of curiosity that I have is how can we check large language models for robustness, right? So I think that this is an inevitable model that we'll be using in economics, but I'm not sure how from now on we will be able to check if the model is if the results are dependent on the actual large language model or not. So I would like to hear what's the thought of the author regarding that. And so the findings, I had a different number, but the storage shock is a positive effect on GDP and prices. This, in the version I got, was a lot larger. I thought it was even too large, but in this version it's a lot smaller and more consistent with the size of the austerity shock. But we have all kinds of good news, right? So positive market reaction and more confidence and credit consumption, etc. So what I would pose as a question about this is, okay, the conventional wisdom is that austerity is contractionary, right? But there is a story being told that austerity makes agents more confident, it lowers fiscal risk and increases confidence on the future path of the economy. So, but at the same time, the usual story of expansionary austerity is related to maybe an improvement in allocation, right? So we are taking resources away from bad spending, and this improves potential output, or we are improving the credit market conditions. So this doesn't feel like an aggregate demand impulse story. This feels like a more of a greater potential output story. So which is the story that the mechanism that is being proposed here? I think the effect that we should see on data really should be different in those two cases. Also, the paper connects austerity to lower risk, and I actually present a paper which kind of provides this bridge theoretically, so it's a sort of complement, I think, but I think it's very hard to integrate aggregate demand fluctuations in this sort of models, and we still don't actually know how sovereign risk and monetary policy, and we have papers on that, but they are not part of the workhorse, I think, of most monetary policy and fiscal policy. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty on what should happen in this situation, right? And lastly, I think it was addressed in the end of the presentation, but I think it's a genuine concern. So are we measuring shocks, or are we, what we are seeing is changes in fiscal rules or regimes, right? So we had these changes in Brazil in the last 20 years. We had a spending cap that was approved, and the spending cap was removed. So this seems to me not like a story of a shock occurring in a stable equilibrium, but a story of changing equilibrium, right? We are changing rules, so we are going from one equilibrium to the other, and so this should be different than when we are measuring like small perturbations around some rule. So I think that the paper would benefit from considering those things, and I think that what in the last paper, in the last section, when we are talking about state dependent, I think that's in the way of this perception. So what I would put as suggestions is just validate fiscal event classification. I think it's done, but the thing with the large language models is a concern, right? I don't know how sensitive the results are. So and how more conventional narrative identification would work in this case. I think a previous version already had something like that. Explore the different regimes, right? Which is already being done, as I understand. And then another question is about asymmetry, which was made by the audience, right? Is there a difference between austerity and expanding, right? And so, if not, why the focus on austerity, right? I think we should know both sides of the story, what happens. But I think the paper is very provocative, so it's good, the paper, right, or should be when I read it. and I really looking forward to reading whole and seeing your answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor. Miguel, please, your reply.
So I have work. Okay. So I got 5 points. I'll try to do them in order. So on the measuring of fiscal events, absolutely, I think that this is partly my fault in the interest of time, where I skipped a little bit. I just mentioned really briefly what we consider, what we are grouping in terms of those fiscal events. And I said something that has direct effects on public finances, speeches by government officials, and monitoring things. So we could discuss, and we try to justify our choices, like, if the president, or if a president says he's not going to fulfill the primary target, that's just a declaration. Is that a fiscal event? Is it not? That we decided to consider a fiscal event. But there is a judgmental choice on something. No, there could be events that affect public banks, right? Those we don't consider. We view those as not inherent to fiscal policy, but then inherent to the to the public entity that spills on fiscal policy. So, but those are choices that we made that I didn't justify that well in the paper. We'll do. On the LLM, how to check for robustness. Again, there's something that there's not enough time in a presentation, but robustness, there's 2 cents in here. So trying other LLMs that we haven't tried. So I can say we use it ChatGPT. We haven't tried, say, DeepSeek or anything. But for robustness in the sense of validating the process, we did that extensively, and part of the contribution we will have is how to do it. So basically, we have this 25,000 news. We had initial brainstorms, we read the newspapers, and we agreed on these 3 classes of events. Then we do it via prompt. So we construct a prompt. And then we had a whole mechanism where we draw samples of 1,000 news from the 25,000. Those we review manually, those 1,000 headlines. We classify errors into type 1 and type 2, take the errors, parse it into the prompt, run it again, see if it decreased, and iterate until the sum of the errors less than 3%. Then we draw another sample of 1,000 and keep on repeating. And we repeat this 3 times. Then, after 3 times, we scale it to the whole 25,000 news. And then, on the 25,000 news, it identifies about 2,000 as fiscal. Those 2,000 that he classified as fiscal, we review manually as well. We don't review, of course, those that he said that were not fiscal because, and in training he did well that. The tricky thing is that he says many things are fiscal that are not. So there's a whole procedure, and I'm confident we are doing it right in that sense. On the effects being too large, it's a minor thing. So the effect that was there before, so I was mentioning the primary surplus increase of 36 bases in 1 year, and I was quoting I was mentioning the peak effect. So the peak effect of GDP is 1%, but it happens at 15 months and not at 12. So to be consistent that I'm saying fiscal realized after 1 year, I'm citing but the 1% is there, it just happens at 15 months. Improvement in allocation, that's a great question. We have nothing to say about it because this is a paper spirit of what we discussed in the last session, this is a paper about big G minus T, or T minus G. It would be interesting, we could take this shock series, maybe look it at the micro level and see what type of austerity is this. Is it improving allocation? Is it not? I think you have a point. Maybe there are certainly papers to be written there, but we have nothing to say because of our method. On the shocks versus regime, I guess there's two parts. The regime change that we are exploring this 2013, we are trying to work on that. But it's true that we do identify a shock, but there's a question on whether that shock is temporary or permanent, right? We don't use for identification types of restrictions. Oh, I want to identify permanent shock, so I use long-run restrictions. We don't do it because we do it high frequency. Is it true that ex post, the shock that we find, if you see, maybe it's a stretch to call it permanent, but to a horizon that we look, 24 months, it generates a persistent increase in primary surplus. It plateaus there around 40 basis points above what it would have been without the shock. So it does seem up to an horizon of 2 years, the shock seems to have permanent effects on fiscal variables. So point well taken. Thanks for all the comments, and again, sorry for the mess.
So now we will open the floor. Let's start with Ivan. A lot of questions here. We're trying to manage. See here, there, yeah, and also here, yeah.
Hi. Can you hear? So I had a question about second moments, because I don't remember perfectly your picture where you identify these fiscal shocks, but it seemed to be that there's like a negative and then a positive shock, and then a negative and a positive shock. And I could imagine there are like second moment effects going on here. Like, I mean, I'm more familiar with the case of the US when there's like, oh, we're going to shut down the government. And then one day they're like, oh, we're not going to shut it down. The other day, we're going to shut it down. They end up shutting it down for a few days. Then they like change the debt limit. So I wonder, because you could also think that that's going to have an effect on firms postponing investment or taking decisions, and therefore it could change. I think it could complement, because as you said, you don't have a proper event, and here it's like compared to like monetary policy meetings. So what is an event? It's also more blurred, and therefore one event could be just noise that is filled with like news and bad news one day after the other.
It's a great point. So in some sense, because we use the median of the expectations or the mean in the robustness, we're only capturing first moment shocks. It's a little bit like a Jarosinski and karate type of thing. No, you could say within that narrow window, it's only fiscal, but it could be fiscal surprise and fiscal uncertainty that are increasing. We are not yet trying anything to disentangle, but we could think about something, because in the focus survey, even though we use only the mean or the average, we could compute changes in dispersion of those expectations to the extent that that would capture uncertainty about the fiscal. We haven't thought that much. I added that to the list. Thank you.
So here.
Oh, hello?
Hey.
Can you hear me? Okay, Miguel, congratulations for your work, especially about the methodology of high frequency with LLM. That's new to me, so yes, I'd like to make a compliment about that. And yes, fiscal austerity had become a trending topic in Brazil, at least for the last 10 years, I would say. So yes, and I've researched it myself as an example of this trending thing. But I wonder if this methodology, because, well, it makes me think that sometimes the fiscal announcement could come in a very turbulent time.
Yeah. And
sometimes it doesn't. So rhetorics plays a very important role, as well as the context when the announcement is happens. So, for example, a fiscal contraction announcement under Joaquin Levy in Dilma's time could have a negative effect. So, okay, you found that. And a fiscal announcement, fiscal consolidation announced by gadgets could have a positive effect.
Yeah.
So I wonder how can you treat that, or I don't know, because if you see the case of Joachim Levy in Dumas, everything was messed up. So regardless of his announcement, there was a contraction anyway. So I just wonder if we could talk about this specific moments of Brazilian fiscal history.
So I don't think Levy is here, but we have to thank him because a lot of shocks are related to him. If you look at that period, a lot of the negative shocks are there. So I agree with the point on context matters. The way we were thinking about dealing with it was treating as a two regime, kind of pre-2000, post-2014. One thing we could do that you just gave me an idea is we could also try different types of state dependency. For instance, do a state-dependent local projection looking not at the cut, but uncertainty measures in the economy. I guess there's an argument why this would increase or decrease. On the more of kind of how it is announced, kind of more related to Michael's language and so on, I think there might be something there, but don't give ideas to Carlos, otherwise he'll want to put the world into this paper and he'll want to finish it. So, but I think there's a point to it. With the events, now it's easier to select the text and we could build from there and see a little bit like semantics of fiscal policy. Thanks, you just gave me 2 ideas. Thank you.
So, here. No, it's on. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great paper, Miguel. I have several reactions. I'm going to just give you the main 2. I don't know if you check at yields, different yields, because if this is really something related to this good news leads to more kind of risk appetite from the market, you should see in the yields. And presumably the long term, think about the 10-year yield should react, while the short term should stay put. That will give you kind of a very strong argument. This is truly operating through the risk hedging premium channel. I was looking at all the additional exercise. I know that Carlos perhaps want to start doing more stuff, but I think if this works, could help you guys with the point. And the other thing that I was thinking about, actually it's kind of related to the last question, is that, so one thing is about the different signs, so a positive and negative shock, but another thing is the magnitude of the shock. So perhaps what you're really getting is that a reaction for shocks that are really big in terms of, let's say, greater than 1 standard deviation, and that is what giving you the identification. I don't know if you have checked, there's some asymmetry in terms of the magnitude rather than the sign.
Thanks a lot, Javier. On the yields, yes, we do have some stuff that is not there. It's not just CDS. So we did it, for instance, with ACM, Treasury Premium. We constructed that for Brazil, and it falls as well. We also tried with a bunch of yield curve slopes, which is basically our argument, the long versus the short. And it works too in the very short run. In the longest run, we don't go 10 years because in Brazil, data to have a decent range, we go 5 years on different slopes. In the short run, we see it very clear. In the medium run, is more complicated because of the activity. So in the short run, you see only the optimism. But then in the medium run, it's kind of the slope is a less clean measure, I think, because then the increase in activity feeds back. People think that the central bank is going to increase interest rates, and then that starts being contaminated by potential expectations of an exchange rate hike. While the CDS is more on probability of default and so on and so forth, but we have more metrics. Positive versus negative, we are doing. Big versus small, we are not doing it yet. There's an argument that because of the saliency of the events, in some sense, we could think that everything we do is to some extent big events because we pick days in which out of the 3 most read news of Bloomberg, at least 2 were fiscal. So it should be kind of the most salient. So I guess our identification already should clean a little bit the small effects. And maybe there's a point on actually being less stringent, trying, if there's one in the top 3, you'd capture more small effects and then compare those effects. I think the ones that we have are already, the magnitude should be high. Yeah, but thanks for that as well.
So we have Ivan.
Yeah, hi, do you hear me? Yeah, Miguel, the cool paper. So from the graph you showed, it seems that all your fiscal austerity shocks happen during or around crisis episodes. So reinforcing a bit what other people said, I think it's what you're identifying is an uncertainty shock or uncertainty resolving shock in a case of austerity. So spreads is one way to look at that. You could look at economic policy uncertainty indices if they exist for Brazil. To me, that's the main channel. So if you were to replace everything, the fiscal shock by uncertainty shocks, the story would go through and the results too. So, yeah.
We'll try. I don't think, well, if you have some idea on, I cannot think of uncertainty shocks directly for Brazil. But again, if it works in the same way, that doesn't invalidate the mechanism. I'm just tying, in some sense, I'm tying an uncertainty change to fiscal policy. So that's perhaps part of the mechanism. So yeah, but I'll think about that.
You can ask while the microphone gets there.
So thanks, Miguel. Great paper. It's very interesting and provoking to see the positive effects of contractionary fiscal policy. More on the operational side, I don't know if you already know this, but the incentive that participants have to insert their forecasts on primary about critical dates. Have you heard about that or?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you find do you try to specify it differently to cover critical dates rather than the week in which the announcement was made? Because I think, let's say you have something here and then you only have a critical date 3 weeks from now, then most participants are not going to update their expectations this week, but when they update the full panel in 3 weeks, do you find anything different or?
So on the incentives, this is only for those that know the data that we're talking about well. So on the incentives, it's true. The way we mitigate is we need to find some variation. So we look at windows and not individual, just the mean. That's the way we do. The changes that we find are mostly aligned with the sign of the events. So that seems sufficient for us. We haven't digged into the microdata. In the microdata, I could look at those updaters that only updated that and select updates. We have that kind of in the radar. One thing we did that is interesting is that maybe perhaps for the central bank people as well, is they say, oh, but fiscal policy forecast, there's no award. And then people don't take it seriously. And we find that that is not true, at least, we cannot claim, but we did two things. So we talked with people, and it seems that those that do it is usually at big institutions, and they have a team that covers fiscal. So they might decide not to answer, but those that decide to answer, like the marginal, the fixed cost, to Javier's paper, the fixed cost is logging into the computer. If you have a team that has fiscal projections, you're already on the system, you just do it. And a more kind of a concrete proof is that we compare the projections of the focus, the primary surplus from the focus, with, on the sample that's available, with the projections from the Prisma, in which there are incentives. And there's tricky questions because here you forecast in % of GDP, there you forecast revenue. So there's some changes in measurement, but overall they are well aligned, supporting the anecdotal evidence on, we have a team that covers fiscal. The computer is on, we logged on into the focus system, we just reported. So yeah, that would be the answer.
Last question, Michael.
Yeah.
Michael was my professor. Don't ask me the most difficult
I was actually,
question.
I was going to apologize. The only reason I'm asking you a few questions is because your co-author told me I had to. So it's his fault. No, I have 4 things. One, I'm going to show my age. There's a large literature on this from the early 90s. Started with the paper by Giavazzi and Pagano for Ireland and Denmark. And there's a big literature that follows it. And it's interesting, it comes and goes and the name changes. I'd not heard it called expansionary austerity, but fiscal contraction is the same thing. The second, I think the biggest challenge you have is, you mentioned Jaroszynski-Karady. if you did their identification effect, you can't distinguish positive information effect from what you claim is the channel you have. So you have to do more to convince the reader that it's not that right. Their identification is the stock market goes up on the news in the opposite direction. You have that. It could be that the announcement is just the economy is doing better and everyone's learned that from things. Now, you can probably show that in the text and all these other things, but you've got to do that job for the reader. Two other very small points. One is, I think you also have to dig more into the question that came up earlier on allocation. I think, if they're cutting wasteful spending, that's good. If they're, cutting vital spending, that's probably bad. And somewhere in the news, you must be able to get that. And the last channel to explore is political news. I mean, this is a sort of state dependence, but, if you have a left-wing government that cuts spending, they basically kill themselves at the ballot box, at least in the countries I'm more closely aware of. And you can check this because you have polls that are fairly up to date. So if you see that there's a particular side of the government that's going in the wrong way for its base, it happens less, but a right-wing government that announces a big increase in spending could also upset some of their more fiscally conservative people. That sounds like a very German story. But have a look at that. I think it could help you cut into some of the stories.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Michael. 3 great questions, 3 comments. So on the information, yes, it showed up twice. We need to think harder about that. There's only one paper that I'm aware that deals with information effect, which is by Melosi, Zanetti, and the third quarter that I don't remember. But we'll think about if there's something that feasible in the spirit of Jarosinski and Karadi or the others. On the allocation, yes, point well taken. That's a point from Vitor. You just need to see what kind of we'll need some kind of micro data to get this shock to micro data. On the political news, the political news was completely new to me. So, but I think I understood your point. I'll catch you outside and to get more of it. But I think it's interesting. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so thank you, Miguel, for your presentations. Now we move to Mateus' presentation. I'll provide a few comments after he's done.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to the organizers for including our paper and for the incredible conference. I'm also the last obstacle to the cocktail, so I'll try to make it as fast as possible. So this paper is joined with Giacomo Candian, who's a colleague of mine, and it's about trying to understand whether the effects of uncertainty depend essentially on where uncertainty arises along the supply chain. And there's not, I guess, much need to motivate the paper in the context of this room. It's been a long literature that stresses the importance of production network linkages across sectors for the propagation of shocks that originate in particular points of the supply chain. And indeed, recent dynamics of inflation and output the last few years kind of reflect how relative price changes across sectors, in particular in upstream portion of the supply chain, can be extremely important. Now, much less is known, though. This is all about first moment shocks. So think of them as productivity shocks or demand shocks. Much less is known about whether indeed at times of higher uncertainty, supply chains transmission plays any role. And in particular, there are 2 questions that ideally we would like to answer with this paper. The very first one is, suppose that uncertainty goes up in a particular industry. How does this increase in uncertainty is gonna affect uncertainty itself? Oh, sorry. Okay, I didn't realize. is going to affect uncertainty itself in industries that are directly or indirectly linked through the supply chain, production, and prices. And so after we established how essentially a change in uncertainty and a particular point of the network kind of transmits across sectors, we want to ultimately understand whether the macro effects of uncertainty depends on its origin in the supply chain. Now, we're going to do this empirically and then with a model. But it just need to be clear, this is a challenging, it's a challenging task, and there are three main challenges. The very first one, it's probably the reason why until now the literature on uncertainty mostly focuses on aggregate outcomes, is that we kind of lack measures of sectoral uncertainty to begin with. So not only we don't have measures of sectoral uncertainty, but we also need to come up with a way to kind of identify variation that can be used to kind of estimate this supply chain transmission. And so, in particular, uncertainty moves within the network because of first moment shocks. That is directly because there are demand or supply events that endogenously trigger uncertainty. And that variation is problematic to use if you want to identify the effects of variation across sectors. But also, there is the fact that uncertainty may just change in industries that are supplying intermediate inputs or that are buying goods from an industry. And also, this variation is problematic. And so a lot of the talk actually is going to be about the first two parts. Once we have this variation, then this is about how you actually measure this network effects. So let me tell you how we do this very quickly. So the very first thing is we start with micro options data from option matrix, which is basically the universe of options that are traded in US exchanges. And we take implied stock volatility from this data set. And starting from this, we construct sectoral uncertainty measures at the finest possible level, which is this NAICS4 digit. Why NAICS4? Simply because this is the most disaggregated level for which you have consistently data on employment, prices, and input-output linkages. So this is not about us being stuck on NAICS4 per se. It's just the finest possible level at which you can measure input-output linkages at high frequency monthly, yet having also data on employment and prices. So after we construct this measure, I'm going to tell you how we kind of purge this measure from a variation that it's not suitable if you have to do this estimates across sectors. And so I'm going to tell you how we kind of make it orthogonal to first moment shocks and uncertainty that arises in connected sectors. And then we're going to estimate using this basically residual uncertainty from the regional measures. We're going to estimate the dynamic response of employment and prices, first of all in industries where uncertainty increases. And then we're going to measure it also along the supply chain. That is, in industries that are upstream, that are providing intermediate inputs, and industries that are downstream, that are buying output. And then we're going to look at the aggregate level. And so this is going to just be evidence about price and quantity responses at the sectoral level and at the aggregate level. To make sense of this estimates, we actually build a new Keynesian production network model which has time-varying sectoral uncertainty. And that model not only is consistent with the data, but kind of rationalizes what we find. So let me just tell you what are the main punchlines of this, and in case I don't make it entirely. So the first result is that higher uncertainty within a sector is contractionary, not surprising, and it's inflationary. So prices go up within an industry when uncertainty increases. At the same time, uncertainty propagates through the supply chain, and it propagates asymmetrically. So on the one hand, uncertainty in one industry triggers uncertainty in other industries. And at this point, you may think, okay, so the aggregate effect is just basically driven by this, the fact that uncertainty goes up somewhere in the network and it goes up everywhere. And that's the end of the story. In reality, it's a little bit more complicated than that, in the sense that besides the fact that uncertainty in one particular portion of the supply chain triggers uncertainty elsewhere, uncertainty propagates through the supply chain also with first moment effects. What does it mean? It means that this contraction within industry where uncertainty increases is going to propagate as a negative demand shock upstream. So for my suppliers, the fact that I now face more, I'm a sector right now, I face more uncertainty, this is going to essentially look like lower employment and lower prices for the industries that are giving me intermediate inputs. But for the industries that are actually buying my output, this is going to look like a negative supply shocks. So employment is going to contract, but prices are going to increase. And the implication of this is that this heterogeneity at the sectoral level kind of implies that at the aggregate level, potentially, the effects of uncertainty depends on price and inflation, depends on where uncertainty increases in the network. And indeed, that's what we find. So uncertainty at the aggregate level is contractionary, but it's inflationary, provided that it originates sufficiently upstream in the network. Just to fix idea, upstream in the network, think about commodity sectors, just to have a reference point. So at the end of this, we're going to simply lay out a production network model with fairly standard features, but time-varying uncertainty at the sectoral level. And this model kind of does two things. The first thing is it shows exactly that this asymmetric propagation of uncertainty along the supply chain has to do with the fact that on the one hand, when uncertainty goes up, intermediate input demand goes down. So upstream, this is lower output and prices. But at the same time, the fact that prices go up within the industry, that makes my goods more expensive for whoever has to buy them. And indeed, this marginal cost increase, this pass-through downstream explains the asymmetric effect and consistent with the price response that we estimate. And the other piece that I guess you want to retain from the theory part of the paper is that this doesn't really matter what kind of uncertainty you're talking about, meaning that this theory shows that whether it's supply-driven uncertainty or demand-driven uncertainty that you consider, the effects are the same. So essentially, what it matters for aggregate inflation is where uncertainty goes up, not so much whether this is supply-related uncertainty or demand-related uncertainty per se. It's just the network position that determines this. I'm going to skip the literature because I'm doing awfully with time. Let me get to the measure itself. So I started this by saying, look, I mean, we don't have measures of uncertainty at the sectoral level. In particular, we don't have measures that are high frequency and broad in terms of coverage across sectors. So what we do is we start with daily firm level data, in particular implied volatility for stock options data. So implied volatility is essentially the conditional variance of a stock return over the life of the option. This is attractive for a couple of reasons. It's a forward-looking measure of uncertainty. It's high frequency, so the data are daily, and it has a very extensive sectoral coverage. So this is, as I was saying, next 4-digit means about 240 industries, roughly defined. Now, implied volatility is different from realized volatility. Realized volatility is just the square returns. Now, realized volatility is truly a backward-looking measure that actually reflect past price. was not staying here, not that this thing, okay, I understood. Realized volatility, essentially think of it as essentially reflecting the realization of first moment shocks, whereas implied volatility is truly a forward-looking measure of uncertainty. So now we focus on particular type of option is equity-based, at the money options within 30 days maturity. I guess the part that probably is more important is we're kind of careful in trying to pick to consider firms for which we have consistent data for a sustained period of time. So we use options that are traded for at least 10 years. We also only use industries for which we have that the issuers of options account for at least 20% of the market cap of the industry. You still want to have some reasonable representativeness. And then essentially we, starting from this firm level data, we aggregate, the baseline aggregation is a weighted average of this firm level implied volatility. Oh, thank you. No, oh, it works? Okay, thanks. There are alternatives we're considering, and those alternatives, rather than just taking a weighted average across firms in a day, we actually try to extract a common component of the firms within an industry. The result that I'm going to show you now are just obtained using this weighted average of implied volatility across firms. The weights here, we consider different set of weights, market cap weights or sales. The results are fairly similar. So we construct this at the daily frequency. So we have the sigma ID, which is this daily measure of sectoral volatility, and we construct then a monthly measure. Remember the data, employment and price data are the monthly frequency. And we use the last 5 days of the month, and it's going to become clear in a second why this is the baseline specification. We're going to exploit the fact that we have this daily variation to kind of control for uncertainty happening in supply, in upstream and downstream industries. So once we constructed this measure here of sectoral uncertainty, we also want to kind of measure for each industry how much uncertainty there is among industries that are supplying intermediate inputs and in industries that are buying output from each industry. So here, there's nothing creative. We just essentially follow what the literature has been doing since a couple of decades. We take input-output tables. Those are total requirements. So we construct two measures. For each industry I, you measure what's that industry upstream uncertainty, that is uncertainty for the industries that are supplying intermediate inputs. That's the first one up there. And then we construct a measure of customer uncertainty, which is again, this weighted average of uncertainty using input-output table, in this case, for output demanded in the Leontief inverse form, which simply means accounting for direct input-output linkages and indirect ones. Okay, so if you are in this literature, this would be total requirements. So we have this measure, and suppose that for a second you just want to take this measure and you want to run a local projection. So imagine that you have some variable on the left-hand side, think of it as employment, and you want to regress it on this sectoral measure of uncertainty. Clearly here there's a problem, right? And the problem is the fact that this sectoral measure is endogenous, and it's moving for all sorts of reasons, starting from the fact that there are first moment shocks, and we know that uncertainty moves in response to first moment shocks. So if there are negative demand shocks in an industry or negative supply shock in an industry, uncertainty may increase, and that's an endogenous response to a first moment shock. So this example with commodity prices, this is probably the simplest one to understand. Commodity prices increase, and then uncertainty spikes in energy intensive industries. The second issue is the fact that there is uncertainty everywhere else. So that in particular, there are changes in uncertainty that are originating among supplier and customer industries. And there is also uncertainty that is completely common across industries. So we want to use variation, of course, that is orthogonal to first moment shocks and orthogonal to variation that is stemming from supplier and customer for each industry. So how can we do this? So we run a first stage regression. The left-hand side is this industry level uncertainty. And on the right-hand side, there are two terms. I don't know if the pointer, it's me that does not understand. Okay. So here there are two basically kind of identifying assumption, if you want. I don't know if I want to call them identifying assumption, but the very first thing is the fact that you can see here there is this measure, which is realized volatility. Again, realized volatility, think of it as movements in volatility due to first moment shocks. So here we control for realized volatility, past realized volatility. This is fine. The problem is what you do within a month. And the identifying assumption here comes from work by Giglio, Berger and quarters, sorry, Berger, Giglio, and other quarters. The idea is that essentially realized volatility can affect uncertainty immediately. So if there is a demand shock today, uncertainty can move immediately. But uncertainty shocks, true uncertainty shocks, on average, don't have an effect on realized volatility. So that's the first identifying assumption. Second one is the fact that we include controls for supplier and customer uncertainty, and here we exploit the fact that we have this daily data. So we construct this measure of supplier uncertainty and customer uncertainty using the first 16 trading days. And then of course, we include controls for aggregate uncertainty. So now, this residuals, basically, for implied volatility kind of have reasonable statistical properties. They're not autocorrelated. The cross-industry correlation is not large. They're also not particularly skewed in a portion of the network. So this is showing you, is plotting the distribution of uncertainty shocks volatility. And this is the overall sample. This is just considering the relatively most upstream industries, where here upstreamness is defined by a standard index that Poland Trust constructed 15 years ago or so. As you can see, the distribution of uncertainty shocks volatility is fairly similar in the most upstream and the least upstream industries. So at this point, we also do something else. We ask ourselves what could be left in here. We know what is left statistically. It's what's left in there is variation in implied volatility in the sector that could be common across firms. It could also be uncertainty that is affecting particular large firms in that industry. In this particular, the baseline version of this, we retain this variation. And we can check for the largest shocks whether they kind of relate to some narrative that we can trace in the news. I'm not going to talk about this much, but the largest shocks are associated with events. There are regulatory changes that happens in industries. There are financial restructuring episodes. There are trade tensions episodes. So there is in the paper, we discuss a little bit of this. We're trying to do more. So far, basically, I told you how we constructed the sectoral measure of uncertainty shocks. What do we do with it? We construct a measure of upstream exposure to this sector uncertainty shocks. This is the mirror image of the sector uncertainty that I gave you before, but done with shocks. And a downstream exposure to sectoral uncertainty. And at this point, sorry, I skipped, okay, well, anyway. At this point, I don't know, I skipped the local projection slide. We estimate a local projection. Sorry, I don't know what happened. But we estimate a local projection in which we have, on the left-hand side, employment growth. So essentially, go back to this one here, but essentially this left-hand side variable is going to be employment growth. There's going to be here the own uncertainty shocks that we have identified. There's going to be the upstream and downstream shocks, and there's going to be fixed effect and lag controls. That's very standard. So let me tell you what we find. So the middle column here is plotting the effects of uncertainty the average effect of uncertainty in the industry where it originates. So uncertainty itself goes up. That's kind of a sanity check. The first variable here is employment within the industry. And as you can see, employment declined. Those are months. And the second row here, the third one in the figure here, is the response of prices in the industry. And as you can see, the average response of prices is positive. So within the industry, this is a contractionary shock that is also inflationary. On the left-hand side here, you have instead what happens upstream relative to the industry, so the supplier industries. So here, first row here tells you what happens to uncertainty itself, and uncertainty increases, even though the magnitude of this is basically a fifth of the own industry effect. Employment also falls in industry, and price decline. So again, this is just basically telling you it's consistent with a demand shock. Both quantities and price are declining in industries that are giving you intermediate inputs. Downstream, instead, uncertainty also increases in that industry. Employment falls, but prices are actually going up. And so if you now look at just the movement that's in there, this looks like a negative supply shocks for customer industries. So the question now becomes, this is all industry level evidence at a fairly disaggregated level. What are the aggregate effects of this sectoral uncertainty shocks? So first of all, we estimate the average effects of this. So the very first thing we do is we just aggregate the sectoral uncertainty shocks across sectors. And again, we run a local projection. At this point, it's an aggregate local projection. And on the left-hand side, again, we have employment and core CPI and the VIX itself. This is just picking up the average effect at the aggregate level of this. And what you see is that the VIX itself responds and it increases. It's fairly persistent. Aggregate employment declines, and core CPI, the point estimate increases, but is largely not significant. So the question is, does the inflation response, the aggregate inflation response, depend on where uncertainty is originating in the network? Meaning, the industry level evidence tells you prices increase upstream, decrease upstream, but they increase downstream. So in supplier industries, there is deflation, if you want, and customer industries, there is inflation. So what we do here is we consider a different local projection in which we partition shocks between relatively more upstream industries, and that's the top decile of shocks in terms of upstreamness, and the bottom decile. So we basically take shocks only from the two extreme portion of the distribution. And the first one is measuring essentially relatively upstream shocks, is aggregating, relatively upstream shocks. The second one is aggregating relatively downstream shocks. So we rerun this local projection, and this is the result for inflation. So the left-hand side shows you that if shocks are originating relatively upstream in the network, so among industries that provide intermediate inputs, this is actually inflationary at the aggregate level. Whereas the average effect is not inflationary when you look at uncertainty that is originating in the relatively downstream portion of the network. So not going to give you any detail of the model, but essentially I've shown you a bunch of co-movements in response to these identified shocks. So the question is how can you rationalize this? So what we do is we basically construct a standard production network model. There are two non-standard elements, if you want. The first one is the fact that we introduce second moment shocks that are sector specific, and we consider both TFP volatility shocks, but also demand shocks. We introduce sectoral government spending to illustrate this. The model for the remaining features are kind of standard relative to production network models. The only thing that is more general relative to kind of the textbook version of the new Canadian production network model that you've seen many times is the fact that we allow for complementarity between labor and intermediates. Okay, so we don't impose a Cobb-Douglas technology. And so what we do with this model, we take a three-sector version of this, and it's a very stylized version of this model. And we consider an uncertainty shock in sector 2, which think of it as a linear network, even though we consider a more empirically plausible one. So the sector 2 is the sector in between, and we have an uncertainty shock in that sector. It's a mean preserving increase in uncertainty. And essentially we look at propagation within sector and across the network. So let me just show you this, and then I'll conclude. So essentially this is sector 2 is where uncertainty is going up, okay? Here we try to discipline this. We construct a model implied VIX, so this is a shock that's kind of comparable to the empirical shock, even though right now the quantities don't really pay attention. Just look at qualitatively the responses. So sector 2, you have the red line is employment. So employment is falling when uncertainty is going up. This is for TFP uncertainty, but government spending volatility shocks are the same. So employment declines and inflation goes up. Why inflation goes up? In this particular model, it's a standard price setting friction that introduces precautionary pricing. So there's more uncertainty. Firms want to raise markups in response to uncertainty. It's not really key whether the spike in uncertainty in the industry is driven by precautionary pricing. There could be other stories. There could be financial constraints. There's several alternative reasons why you can use to explain why prices go up in the industry where uncertainty increases. The key point is the fact that the model explained the propagation upstream and downstream in a fairly obvious but transparent way. So the model tells you when the industry that became more uncertain contracts production and increases prices, intermediate input demand declines, and that's the employment decline here in sector 1. And at the same time, as demand falls, prices among suppliers, they decline. In sector 3 instead, it's the cost channel that dominates, and provided that intermediate and labor are complements in production, the fact that intermediates for sector 3 have become more expensive imply that this sector as an incentive as a reduction in intermediate input demand that basically reduces employment as well. So, and the model also kind of matches the conditional effects of uncertainty depending on where it arises in the network. So basically the paper is kind of saying that the sectoral origins of uncertainty matters in particular for inflation dynamics. If uncertainty increases upstream in the network, this tends to be inflationary. It's not inflationary if uncertainty is increasing more downstream in the network. And a standard new Canadian production network model actually has predictions that are consistent with the data. And I'm 1 minute late, so I'll hand it to Juan.
Thank you, Matteo. Okay, so now I took off my hat of moderator, and now I'll present some comments. You want to introduce
Now,
me, please?
Ângelo from Banco Central do Brasil is going to discuss Mateus' paper.
Thank you, thank you. Since central bankers, they always have to present the usual disclaimer, so those are my opinions, not opinions of the institution. So let's move on. So we have here from the paper a clear question, which is how sectoral uncertainty propagates through the production networks. They use an amazing data set, very granular financial data on option stocks, and provide a clear matching to the national accounts. I think from this perspective, Mateus' presentation was not fair to the amount of work that they seem to put in the paper describing the matching of the options data and the NICS data to create this very large data set in terms of industry level. There's a clear, well-detailed empirical strategy where from the time series of uncertainty, they derive the so-called uncertainty shocks from the data set, and then they take these shocks and use on local projections to estimate the impact of uncertainty shocks on macro aggregates. So it's a very clear, defined empirical strategy. And given the results, they move to a theoretical model, which is basically a very small scale DSG model, where they try to replicate the results obtained in the empirical session. This discussion basically will focus on three main points. First is more of a curiosity on the data sets, not a criticism, but a curiosity related strictly to the data set. Then I'll move to some questions or suggestions about the estimation of the shocks and the impact on aggregates. And then finally, I will ask a few questions about the structural model. Mateo didn't provide a lot of details, but he knows that I like it in terms of the model, so I'll try to just understand what is going on. So in terms of the data set, I mean, main step, what did he do? Imply volatilities using Black-Scholes formula, combining information from options and the stock price levels. Then he take these data, matches with NICS information to describe the sectoral uncertainty level. The final sample is not described on the paper, but I could infer from the pictures that it started on early 1995 and finished right before the pandemic. My natural question here, the pandemic was a huge shock that basically generated a lot of uncertainty all around the economy. Why not adding data to the pandemic? What was missing? I mean, we didn't have options traded at the time, or stock prices just went crazy that you basically could not derive an implicit volatility from the Black-Scholes options. I mean, what went wrong that we didn't have data after the pandemic? I think it's a natural extension to your work. The second part, I mean, there's a clear regression, well-defined regression to derive the shocks from the time series of the volatility over time. And here is more of a, let's say, I didn't feel very comfortable with the discussion on the paper saying, okay, some variables, and especially the, let me see if this one works. Okay, got it. So some variables here have a lag from 0 to 3, here 0 to 3, but here's a lag variable. These are, basically I didn't find very convincing some of the arguments of what should be contemporaneous, what should be lagged. Just a suggestion, I think it's easier to discuss if you just put the information on a VAR, like basically it's all financial data. I know there's the discussion of what's forward-looking, what is backward-looking, but at the end of the day, everything is sort of financial data with similar, or at least close to similar volatility. So run a VAR and let's discuss some sort of identification of your shocks under the VAR. Maybe that would be a better way to avoid the discussion of what should be contemporaneous, what should be lagged to obtain these shocks. So let's move to a more structural way to derive the shocks. And from this perspective, I think maybe a VAR is a better strategy. A VAR maybe with a few exogenous variables in terms of the controls might be helpful. Just a suggestion here. Finally, let's move, there's also the discussion on the aggregates. We have some very clear results, and now it's the time that I review my complete ignorance in terms of local projections and how they actually work. I was kind of bothered with the results of the impact on uncertainty downstream and upstream after an uncertainty shock in a given sector. I'm totally convinced, I mean, I have given the pictures and the results that basically in this part of the figures, I'm convinced that uncertainty from one sector is spread both upstream and downstream to other sectors. But my question is, and again, totally ignorant in terms of local projections, if there's a sort of a statistical test that basically I could say that on average here you have a significant downstream, a significant propagation downstream over these horizons that you estimated the effect. And same way in terms of the upstream, there's a joint test that could basically say, okay, I do not reject that shocks propagate to the upstream. I mean, on average, I'm visually, I think it's cool, but I think more of a formal test, if there is such thing, would be great. Finally, in terms of the structural model, here I'm quoting the paper. The idea of the model was basically like, let's put together the minimum set of ingredients that are necessary to study network propagation of uncertainty shocks. The model very, very clear, very sharp. Three main ingredients: Calvo pricing, complementarity between labor and intermediate inputs in production, and imperfect sectoral labor mobility. As clear as possible. Worth discussing, and that's where I will basically trying to find out, and I want really to hear Matteo about it. Agents in this economy, they have Epstein-Zinn preferences of the type that I'm just replicating up there. And I think there might be something going on here. Of course, you can use Epstein-Zinn. It doesn't cost you anything in terms of model solution, since you are already using a third-order perturbation of the model, because you have to consider the stochastic volatility in the shocks. But is it really necessary? Because, I mean, there's a tricky interaction between the stochastic discount factor that you use on Calvo pricing and that you use when you have Epstein-Zinn. I mean, authors are at least more explicit about what is your stochastic discount factor that firms will be pricing, because firms basically take the expected discount value of profits over time. I mean, usually in a model without Epstein-Zinn preferences, the stochastic discount factor is the same between households and firms. I don't know what kind of stochastic discount factor you use for pricing, and I really don't know if it's necessary to have Epstein-Zinn preferences to generate the type of precautionary pricing that basically gives you the result that when uncertainty goes up, you have fall in employment and a rise in prices. I mean, in terms of precautionary pricing, I mean, if we move to other papers that used it in Fernandes Villaverde and authors in 2015, the fiscal volatility shocks, that's your reference for precautionary pricing. They don't use Epstein-Zinn preferences. So here I'm kind of confused why it's necessary. One possible explanation, again, I'm just repeating to reinforce the argument, I mean, in terms of Calvo pricing, I mean, are you actually using the stochastic discount factor from, derived from Epstein-Zinn preferences to plug it in on Calvo pricing to get somehow an amplified event? Given your parameters, and again, your parameters for, especially in terms of risk aversion compared to the IES, the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, there's a clear preference for early resolution of uncertainty. So I don't know if you think of that basically as a sort of way to amplify precautionary pricing, but at the end of the day, I don't think if it was necessary. And if you want just like, as you mentioned in the paper, the minimum ingredients to get precautionary pricing, I don't know if Epstein-Zinn are necessary. So anyway, great paper, love reading it, a lot of work in that. Congratulations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for reading. Yes, I don't have much to say. It's like thanks a lot, first of all, for stepping in and discussing it. Completely agree. Epstein-Zinn is mostly to kind of get movement in the model-based VIX that are consistent and to amplify quantity responses. But if you the key point is the fact that there are nominal rigidities in this particular model. That's where you get the effects. If there were no price rigidities in here, there would be absolutely no effect of the second moment shock, granted. If you remove Epstein-Zinn qualitatively, the story is basically the same. The impulse responses, we have the bands around the local projection estimates. I guess we could test the overall significance of that. It's definitely worth looking into it. Miguel was telling me, indeed, Jordan has as a test for that. Nobody really does it seriously, but should probably be done. And so about the pandemic, the short answer is that we're doing it, we are extending it. When we started, we had data until 2023, and so right now, I mean, we updated everything, we're running it. There are challenges, of course, with the pandemic, so right now it's out, but we updated the data, we're getting to that. That's it.
Okay, awesome. So now we can open for questions. Questions from the audience? Anyone? Okay, over there. Microphone. It's coming.
Hi. Thank you very much, Matteo. Great paper, very interesting to hear about that. I was wondering, I really like your measure of sectoral uncertainty, and obviously there's been a great amount of work going into that. Have you looked at some notable historical events of that sectoral uncertainty? I'm thinking of, for example, COVID, let's say 2nd of April, and does that even make sense? Because these are aggregate events, right? But would we expect to see something in the sectoral uncertainty in this case? Can you maybe elaborate on that, how we should think about that?
Yes, that's a very good point. So, and I mean, if I went back, I had a backup slides where there is a list of some narrative examples of the
the largest spikes that we identify. So you're absolutely right in saying that when there are large uncertainty shocks that are spanning across sectors, so the way we are identifying things, we are basically throwing some of the uncertainty variation away because there is a trade-off. You want to have input-output linkages measured accurately. You kind of need to use variation that gets more idiosyncratic, and so there would be it still variation across sectors, and that basically capturing the residual sectoral variation, say in COVID, that basically is not explained by the aggregate part. But definitely, in principle, there are multiple NAICS-4, say, that not all of them necessarily that are subject to the same shocks. Think about trade tensions right now. It's not just one NAICS-4 in principle. There's multiple NAICS-4 that is involved. So the way we're doing it is not that we believe that uncertainty truly arises at NAICS-4. We're not stuck up on that. It's just that we need variation at that level of aggregation to kind of claim we can identify anything that is minimally credible. So we throw some variation away, definitely. But good point. Thank you.
More questions? No? Everybody excited about the cocktail, I think. More questions? No? So again, I want to thank Mateo and Miguel for their presentation. We are gonna have right now here at this auditorium the ceremony to present the prizes for best working papers of Central Bank of Brazil, and right after that we have the cocktail again. Thanks for the presenters. Thanks, Vitor, for staying for the comments, and thank you so much for staying with us until the end. Thank you.